Hello, sense makers, and welcome to Making Sense of Ourselves, a podcast about the hard work it takes to figure out who you are and what you want in this world. I'm Abby Covert, and with me is my co-host, Alfi. In this episode, we talk through a framework that helped our students work through what we're calling collaborative problem solving with a peer stranger. If you listened to the last episode, you already know that some of those peer strangers went on to become not just friends, but also accountability buddies with those former strangers. To get us into that topic, Alfi, can you set up where your thinking came from in terms of peership and the power of dialogue?
100%. And it's good to be back chatting with everyone. And, this was always an interesting one for me because, my difficulty with the reading has always meant speaking and communication by the spoken word has always been close to my chest. And so, when I initially started exploring the idea of, peership and self-directed learning, I always had at the back of my mind the question of where should speaking and conversation fit into that landscape. And so in that exploration, there were a couple of main ideas that sort of drew me to kind of seeing how dialogue could integrate into this. And the first one is from an American doctor called Mortimer Adler, and he's got a book that I absolutely love. I think I've listened to it like 4 or 5 times, called How to Speak, How to Listen. And in that book, there are a lot of different things he covers, but the main one that I think was super interesting was this idea of the meeting of minds. And it's specifically the type of a stage of connection while people are communicating in which they may not necessarily agree with one another, but I clearly understand what you mean and you clearly understand what I mean. And, how that distinguishes, I think, from a lot of the arguments and conversations that we have, especially in the modern days, like most of the time we sort of try to jump on a person as soon as they've said something before we understand whether what they said was even what they meant. Because I think, especially being a talkative person myself, I know that I get my foot in my mouth more often than I'd like to admit. And so what the meeting of minds essentially tries to identify or highlight is that there is a significant difference between hearing what a person said and understanding what a person meant. And that also should be distinguished from agreeing with what you understood, because I think the meeting of minds tries to include both the people that agree with each other as well as the people who don't agree with each other within its boundaries. And that was I think one of the main ideas that sort of helped me to realize that there is something valuable about the process of dialogue, especially when you're exploring things where finding a fact is not the solution. When you're talking about emotions, when you're talking about experiences and firsthand knowledge, there is no place where you can go, there's no dictionary of life where you can go and see what the actual fact is. Instead, we sort of go through this process of exchanging ideas and on an ongoing basis, reaching this meeting of minds and maybe not necessarily agreeing, but at least understanding the world from another perspective. And that's one of the first main ideas that sort of brought us to this. And the second one, which I'd like to touch on before we sort of progress a little bit further, is a very old experiment, which I think a lot of people have gotten to see. And it was from I think, if I'm not mistaken, he's a behavioral psychologist, Daniel Simons. He's got this great experiment of the invisible gorilla. If you haven't seen it, just hop over to YouTube quickly and go search invisible gorilla experiment. But I think the reason why it's specifically important, and I won't go into the details of the experiment itself, I'll just maybe do it top level overview, but essentially what you have is you've got 2 teams of about 5 players on each side, one team wearing black, one team wearing white, and they're passing basketballs within each other. And there's a challenge that's posed to the listener telling you to track the basketball that's going between one of the teams. And so you watch, you count, and then at the end you sort of did you see the invisible gorilla? Or did you see the gorilla? And it turns out that 50% of people missed that. And the specific thing which they're trying to highlight in that experiment is the phenomenon of perceptual blindness. And what that specifically means is the things that we see, how the world presents itself to us, is based on our goals. Mm-hmm. And why is that specifically important? Because that means the goals that you set will define what you see, at least to a degree, because what it's illustrating is when you set the goal of counter the people with white shirts passing the ball, you don't see the black gorilla that's beating its chest and walking by. And why this is specifically relevant to this idea of dialogue is if you're going to set for yourself a learning journey or any kind of growth goal, it's going to make you blind to things by the very fact that it's focusing your attention. Like, in a sense, the opposite side of the coin of focus is blindness to other things.
Mm-hmm.
And so what dialogue allows us to do is it allows other people to kind of check our blind spots. And I think those are the two main things, I think, which brought us to this idea of exploring, dialogue inside the context of peership. And, if I kind of like think about where it eventually led us, and, even after the program, some of the conversations you and I have had, which I hope we'll be able to touch on later, it's really played quite a significant role. And I think I'm quite keen to dive into some of the actual tools that you and I sort of walked through in order to get here.
Yeah, no, that was such a great intro. I feel like I was really shocked, I would say, by how close the people who used some of our frameworks became in the course. But now when I look at them through the lens of what you're talking about in terms of the meeting of the mind and just the power of that outside perspective, like I can see why those things were so powerful. I want to focus first on the kind of the central tool, which is one that I think our students found really helpful. Can you talk us through the 3 conversation flow that we had peers use? And specifically, I think like relating back to you talking about goal setting, like I found that one of the things that could happen in a peership is that you just kind of always are talking around your feelings and kind of never making any progress. But I specifically really appreciated how you encourage students to commit to milestones that were towards their goal and then use this 3 conversation approach to sort of use their peer as that meeting of the minds outside perspective. So yeah, can you walk us through each of those? And I'm going to pull up the screens so we can look at them for those watching by video as well. All right, yeah, talk us through it.
As you mentioned, there were quite a few different micro tools that we had, but one of the main ones that we used when it came to the process of dialogue was this idea of the 3 conversation flow. Now, at the service, it sounds like you need to just talk 3 times, but the idea is that it's actually a 3-step cycle. And the aim of this cycle is to create some kind of what is it called? Oh, it's called a virtuous cycle. And that's essentially what we're trying to do so that each iteration creates an incremental growth. That's sort of like the overall objective. And so if we break down each of those specific conversations, if we look at our students that came into the program, when they got to this stage of the program, where they were is they'd done that initial audit of their past and who they are at the moment in terms of those 4 reflections. And then they did a little bit of work defining their values and mission. So, you've kind of now created these 5 words which represent a significant aspect of who you are. And you've written out this mission statement, which almost defines and pulls together all of those. But it's always so difficult to actually now, when you write these inspiring and amazing sounding missions, it's always so hard to actually put those things into action. And so the first step of this process is to actually state your intentions, is to actually bring your focus in on a specific element. And if we think about the whole perceptual blindness element, what you're doing in this first conversation is narrowing down focus, is removing all the distractions by talking to your peer about what it is that you're actually trying to achieve. Why does that word that is a part of your values represent something specific to you? And then the second main conversation, you see, once you've sort of set your goal and set your intention, essentially obstacles will start to show themselves. And why that's specifically important is for you to actually experience obstacles and see what the problems are, you actually have to have a goal in mind. Because when you have a goal, the problems make themselves visible to you. And so our second conversation is sort of like the first iteration in this process. And that is the process of actual collaborative problem solving. talking with a peer or another individual about a problem, not necessarily with a direct intention of finding a solution, but instead being able to go through the problem in detail and separate, most specifically, separate what the actual problem is versus the problem and the things that you fear are the problem. And so a big part of this is actually talking through the fears that you have in relation to either an experience that has already happened or something that is coming up, a challenge that's coming before you. And so as you actually talk through that problem, you should get to the point where you've defined the problem. And now what this can sort of take one of two directions. One, it might be a problem that you can actually overcome. And so then what we aim to do is sort of take an approach at it and kind of go through the process of trial and error to try and actually work through that problem. Or the second option might be that the goal that you set, the immediate milestone that you set, might be more difficult than it is worth to achieve when you link that back to your original North Star. Because you've got this greater mission that you've defined, and then you define a specific growth point. And when you actually get to the process of putting that into action, you might find that it's too difficult for you actually to get through. So once you kind of go through the cycle of collaborative problem solving a few times and you've tried a couple of different approaches, you'll eventually overcome the challenge, or you might get to the point where you decide to pivot and think about a different milestone, which might be better in terms of progress, but also not as challenging as the initial one that you weren't able to overcome. And then the final one is a lot more focused around reflecting on progress. And I think this third one gets overlooked very often when it comes to the overall process of learning or picking up new skills. Because by the time you get the skill, you're already so happy about the progress that you made that it's easy to kind of like just move on to the next thing. But this is specifically important for two reasons. The first is that it allows you to look back on the milestones that you set and which ones were too hard and which ones were too difficult, specifically to inform how you set milestones in the future, so that you know what is too difficult and what is just difficult enough. Which brings us back to our conversation in the previous podcast about the zone of proximal development and finding milestones which allow you to enter a space of maximal growth and distance out of your comfort zone without pushing you so far that it becomes detrimental. And that sort of is the three that kind of create the eventual cycle that allows us to create that ongoing growth in a flow of dialogue.
I just love the way that this came together. It's so simple, and we just saw it work. I think that's the simplest way about it, not just with ourselves, but also with others. So thank you for taking us through that.
100%. And so, I think it's sort of good for us to talk about this, these three conversations in sort of like in the form of boxes in a relatively idealistic way. But, we eventually actually had to first try this out. And, I know we kind of had a couple of directions we wanted to take this into, but a question that kind of just came to mind initially for me is like, we kind of went through this process trying it out before we started the program. And then in some sense, we've kind of been doing it after the program. And I'd be interested to hear from your side if you have any initial thoughts about like, how you found it when we initially first started figuring out versus what you're finding from it at this point in time. And I know maybe I'm skipping ahead a little bit, but I'd like to get a little bit of your thoughts as well.
Yeah, no, I think I'm glad that you made space for that. Because I feel like we've talked a little bit about it, at least with the students, but giving some space here, I think makes sense. I definitely feel like this framework scared me at the beginning. I think mostly because it does so neatly lay out the steps. And I wondered if that neat and tidiness would be helpful or if it would feel like rigid. But I think in my experience, it's the opposite of rigid. It's more like guiding. And I feel like that's a really important part of it. And I think why students have found it to be helpful and why I personally find it helpful. Like one of the things you called out while you were walking through the flow was how it's really hard to pay attention to the third conversation. And like, yeah, Alfie, I think we might have to call ourselves out on, we've been skipping a lot of conversation tree lately. Mm-hmm.
That's very true.
You heard it here first. But there's been times where I feel like both of us have been like, whoa, let's have a moment and like be like, wow, you did that. Like, let's talk about that. But like, I feel like, it takes the other person to both do that kind of stopping, but then also to like enforce it once, because I'll give you a minute, but I won't give you a whole meeting. I'm not gonna give you a whole conversation. Like, let's move on, pick something new. And so, I feel like I'm hearing from this conversation afresh that we need to take more time. And I would say, like, reflecting back on it, I think that's what I was scared of, was like, it takes so much time, like 3 whole conversations just to pursue one milestone, when like these milestones we were encouraging were small. They were small things. But also like the permission to not achieve the milestone and still see it as a successful part of this process. Like, I think that was the other thing that this this approach gave me. Yeah. It was like, I remember you actually asked me about a milestone the other day, writing a memoir. And the milestone was not to write a memoir, by the way. The milestone was to find a memoir writing class that I could fit into my calendar this year. And the other day, Alfie asked me about it. He's like, how's that going? And I was like, it's not. And so, I feel like the permission to kind of pursue a milestone just for dreaming, just for seeing if it fits, just for funsies. And I think our students did a lot of that. Like, I know one of the ones that brought me to tears was a person that said that they sang in front of their spouse. That was their milestone, was to sing in front of their spouse. And they did it, and they felt so empowered. And I just thought that was such a beautiful example. And like, having 3 conversations about that might seem to a listener to be a lot of commitment up front, but I feel like it really does pay dividends in terms of what you learn about yourself and also the depth that it gives to that relationship.
And this is sort of like the thing about this for me that's so impactful is like, when you think specifically about the last piece that you highlighted, the idea that there's permission to set a milestone, fail, and quit the milestone without feeling like you did something wrong.
Yeah.
And I felt that was of specific value in how it distinguishes itself from how we typically educate people now. Is like, the difference between what we were doing and how we typically try to educate people is like, we give you a test, and if you fail the test, which is essentially a milestone of your learning, if you fail the test, then you don't get to move ahead. You don't get to move on. You don't get to say that maybe this is not for me, let me try something else. And I feel like what this conversation process does is it leaves room for you to try things that are possibly too hard for you. And if it is too hard for you, it doesn't tell you that you're the problem. It tells you that the milestone is the problem.
Yeah.
And that for me, I think, is one of the things that really differentiated this, because then people who maybe had milestones that seemed surface level in the writing, like in the doing, they got to really shine.
Okay, so let's get on to what we talked about kind of this episode being about. So I want to focus on an early outline of some of the work that we did around this course. You wrote a quote that I think really inspired this episode. You said, by embracing the principles of effective dialogue, we can transform our personal relationships, enhance our learning experiences, and contribute to a more inclusive and understanding world. So I would love to just talk through what we see as some of those core principles of effective dialogue. And so the first one that we came up with is to embrace openness and reciprocity. So on the last episode, we talked about the role of the more knowledgeable other. And we've just talked about the meeting of the minds, and showed how amongst peers who are more knowledgeable, they can kind of switch back and forth, like who is the more knowledgeable other. Can you talk about reciprocity and a little bit more about that meeting of the minds concept?
I think that's so well put, and you're like bringing together all the right threads, because the important aspect about the meeting of minds, specifically with regards to reciprocity, is, again, not necessarily to agree with one another, but at least to see things the way they do. And why that's specifically important when it comes to reciprocity is because, I mean, as the term sort of describes, it's about a give and take. That's at least reciprocity from the perspective of its dictionary definition. But when you look at it in the context of this peership, what we're trying to achieve is to allow the person who is growing or developing to enter their zone of proximal development. And what we spoke about in the previous episode is that the more knowledgeable other is the one who is more competent in the domain of the challenge at hand. Now, as we mentioned last time, when you're thinking about a parent and a child or a teacher and a child, it's easy to see who is more competent in the situation. But when we're all adults, it's a little bit like, the lines are a little bit more blurred. And so I think the thing that's important here, and what we got to see in this story from Sarah and Mary last time, was the fact that who is more competent, especially when you're talking about professionals and peers, changes depending on the situation, the context, and each person's unique personality. And so what we then come to realize is that every single person actually has something to give and something to take. And even if it's not, if it's not the knowledge, we have at least got our perspective to share. And that actually more often than not is more valuable than any advice or knowledge that we can give people, because they can go and find the advice and knowledge themselves in Google, in the library, or whatever it might be. But they can't put themselves in your shoes and see things through your eyes. Only you can give that. And so what the meeting of minds defines and why it's so important is for you to be able to act as a zone of proximal development for a peer, which is distinct from a child or a student. You need to be able to put yourself in their perspective so that you can understand the world from their side. But when you can also bring your own experiences and your own understanding to that same context, you've now got the information from two different people, from your own knowledge and your own perspective and your own beliefs, and the person who you're empathizing with and developing this meeting of minds. And so in some sense, you're drawing on from more sources of information. And in the process of dialogue and talking through that challenge, what you do is you allow this person who is facing a challenge and maybe is in an emotional state, maybe they're facing a really difficult problem which has got real stakes. And though they may be more competent, because of the difficulty of the situation, they aren't able to perform in the way that they typically would be. And where the one party would otherwise not have been able to play the role of the more knowledgeable other, because of the fact that they're abstracted from the situation and a little bit separate, they can bring that separation into the conversation and act as a mirror to allow the person who's going through it to essentially be able to lean on their unobstructed perspective. And, it comes again to that question of perceptual blindness. They can cover our blind spots. And I think that's kind of like the main thing that we look to understand when it comes to reciprocity in this process, is understanding that it's not necessarily our knowledge that we bring. Instead, it is when we can see the world from their perspective, from their eyes, but bring our own knowledge and experiences. What we can do is give them our own perspective to make their own decisions and choices on. And that's the first and the first principle, I think, which underlies all of this.
Yeah.
And there is plenty more on that, but maybe before we go ahead, I don't know if you've got any thoughts on that matter particularly.
No, I think that you just described so well. Like, if anyone hasn't listened to episode 2, we have the confidence code example. And I just think that this fits in so beautifully, because it's like Sarah was the originator of the coat, but then Mary kind of like reminded Sarah that she was the originator of the coat by providing the coat for her. It was sort of like the student becomes the master, but I think in peership that's constantly happening. It's like a constant back and forth of those roles. Yeah.
100%. Exactly. And, that sort of sets the stage for the second principle, which I think would be great if you could talk about. And that's specifically seeking to understand before being understood. And as hard as it may sound, there is actually a good reason for doing it. And I think it would be great if you could outline a little bit of that for us. And maybe if there are some experiences or specific moments that stood out to you with consideration to that, it would be great to hear those.
Yeah. Yeah, I think in episode 1, I think we shared towards the end of the episode kind of like the top like ways that you and I are different. And I still have this list on my desk that I add to in terms of like ways that we're different. And I feel like there's like those top line kind of like profile metric ways, like I love sugar, Alfie could do without it, or like I'm a planner, Alfie's not a planner. But I feel like there's this deeper part that you have to get to with peers to really be effective. And it all really is in understanding that perspective and being able to put yourself into their shoes and not assuming that you can do that without spending like a good amount of time and effort to understand that person's perspective. Like, I think that it's very easy for us to go into an interaction and listen to somebody and assume that they're feeling one way or another. But by asking them and actually like probing through how they're actually feeling, and doing that in safe ways over time with permission, like I think that that's kind of the key, or has been one of the keys to partnerships like ours. So I feel like there was a recent example, and I did ask Alfie if this was okay to share because this was only last week, so it's kind of like fresh. But we had a recent interaction where I was just challenged by the idea that I felt like there was things that I wasn't privy to, like that there was things about what Alfie shares, or what you share, Alfie, that there's like kind of this separation when we get into like deeper things. And I had kind of read that as being like he didn't want to share those things with me, was sort of what the story that I had told. That was the assumption that I had made. And I ended up using this example where I was like, in explaining this to Alfie, I was like, I feel like, it's like we're walking down this hallway and I'm learning about you, and we're sharing, and like we're talking and we're walking together, and all of a sudden we get to this beautiful wall that's covered in art and living plants, and it's just gorgeous, and we're talking about this wall, and the next thing you know, I forgot that we were ever even talking about you, like Alfie. And I had assumed in that metaphor that there was this other stuff on the other side of the wall. And when I shared this metaphor, Alfie, your response just like really changed how I feel like I understand you. Your response was that you also don't know what's behind the wall when we're in those situations. And that as a peer, sometimes you would like someone to help find a way to the other side of the wall. And that's actually like something that peership can do for you, because dialogue is such a important part of how you process. So yeah, I just found like that was such an example where like it was just the use of that metaphor that it wasn't even intentional. I didn't even know why that was the one in the moment, but it seemed to click for both of us, and we could finally like come to some sort of understanding about how we really are different. That like to me, a wall means people know what's behind it, and to you, the wall is the end. That's all we know. that's all she wrote. And so, yeah, I think that one was top of mind for me. But how about you?
Definitely. And maybe before we move on, I think I want to add, I guess, my side of that story, because
please.
It was definitely a significant moment for me as well. And I think it illustrates two important things that I want to touch on. One, the actual value of this process of problem solving through dialogue. Because, when you talk about the goals and the milestones and all of that, it's easy to think about this as like from the perspective of career development, or how this is going to let you get the next skill that's going to do great for you. But I think the thing that's even more valuable about it, and the point at which you can benefit the most, is when you use this process on things that even you haven't figured out yet. That there are so many experiences in our lives that were either so difficult, or it was like so much riding on it that when it happens, we barely even get to think about it. We're sort of just like reacting. And then it's like a couple of hours, minutes, or days later, and you're like, what just happened?
Yeah.
And I think a thing I learned about myself a while ago is kind of like coming to the realization that a lot of people that I meet, and a lot of people generally, find social interaction difficult, especially opening up in social interaction. And that's something that I relate to. But I found with time that the way I find it difficult is different from the way a lot of people I know find it difficult. I don't find it difficult to talk and understand the emotions and feelings of other people. I find it much more difficult to understand my own. And so, when you talk about this idea of the wall, one of the reasons why it clicked with me so much is like when you were describing it, it's sort of like you feel like, I'm taking you on this journey, and this journey is almost like me walking you through what my life is like. And then we get to this interest, like, and it's like open, and everything is open, and it's like an open room plan, and there's light coming through the windows, and it's shining everywhere. And then there's this amazingly decorated wall, and I start talking about all the art that's on this wall and all the things that are surrounding it and telling this wonderful story. And then it's sort of like, before you even get to really look at the wall, I kind of whispers away and move on to the next thing before we can dive into it. And in some sense, that was very accurate, but that metaphor described a challenge we were having in discussion.
Mm-hmm.
That's the same about the metaphor. And that is that we're moving on from the wall before the thing has been understood. And that was true. And you were identifying that correctly. But I think that the place where we're sort of like we were getting mixed up was that I wasn't moving away. I wasn't moving away from the wall because I didn't want to talk about it. For me, it was more a time of, we don't have the time to find the door. Like, we've got 20 minutes left, 10 minutes left in our conversation. If we start an excavation project, we're going to be here till the next day. And I think, maybe the message that you were getting from that is that I don't want to share this. But in some sense, for me, it's like, I'm just as curious and I'm just as oblivious as to what's on the other side. And I think, if I take it out of this metaphor of the wall and I think about what this means in terms of interpersonal relationships, I think it's the distinction between a person who feels their emotions deeply and struggles to keep them in, and a person who has muted emotions and struggles to feel them from within. And what that results in is both finding it difficult to open up, but one as a result from building walls, and the other as a result of not knowing how to get through the walls.
Oh, that's so beautifully said, Alfi. Yeah. I think it beautifully tees up the next one, which I'm excited to talk about. So the third principle of effective dialogue that we identified was to acknowledge and navigate emotional reactions, which is all nice to say, but for real, Alfi, any tricks on how to do this? Tricks of dealing with emotions?
I do have a couple of thoughts on this, but I think one of the things that I will say immediately is understanding that it's not all in your control. That's the first thing that will save you a lot of headaches. Is like, if you find that most of the time you're struggling to keep your reactions in, you're not going to one day wake up and be like super zen and your emotions just float by you without an effect. And that's not even desirable. And I think, it comes back to that list that you described of ways that we're different, right? Because I think it's easy to sort of look, for example, at, being able to quote unquote tough it out, or, be the macho guy and not express your emotions. And there are specific situations where that's valuable, whether it's a dangerous situation or like time sensitivity is a factor, then it's good to be able to kind of stiffen up that upper lip and keep walking. But then there are also situations where that's not a good thing. When you're in the middle of a heart-to-heart with your spouse or your partner or somebody important in your life, that's not the time to be stiffening up your upper lip. And if we look back at the conversation you and I were just having about feeling like you need to control your emotions versus feeling like you need to understand them, is like, there are times when it is good to be able to ignore your emotions, and there are times where you need to tap into them. And I think when I was able to tell myself that and understand it and believe it, it immediately made dealing with emotions a lot easier. Because then I realized, like, when a person has an emotional reaction, that's not entirely in their control. That's the first thing. And so it's useful to note that, so that you can, when your reactions then start to rise, you can kind of like keep yourself separate from them and understand that this person is not saying this because they actually hate me, or they're not saying this because they think I'm a terrible person, but because they're having a reaction, and not all of it is in their control. Now, then the second question is, okay, cool, you can distance yourself from that, but what should you actually do with it? And I think this I guess it's definitely a friendship that I hold close to me, though it's in the past. But a good friend of mine, who I really connected with in university. It was at the time, like, I was going through one of the darker times of my life. I was about to drop out of university, struggling a lot, and it was generally not a great time. But she was another person who was also quite different from me in this nature, like extremely in tune with their emotions, and like maybe even sometimes detrimentally so. But the thing that I immediately realized is that emotional sensitivity has specific situations where it's extremely valuable. And that is when you don't have a lot of information. Because one of the great things about emotions is that they give us information when we don't have evidence. It's like when you get a feeling about a person, and you get a feeling that person, there's something strange about them, that is essentially your body telling you, I don't have enough sensory data to tell you this thing, but based on the historical sensory data, there's something strange going on here. And so if I now, if I look at myself and I understand the fact that I'm not a very emotionally in tune person, or let me rather say my emotions are somewhat muted. That's beneficial, as when we talked about the danger situation and all of that. But in other situations that are more reliant on emotion, the situation needs to be a lot worse before my danger bells start ringing. And so if I can get into this reciprocal discourse with a person who does lean a lot more on the emotional side, I can then get the benefits of, in-tune emotion, while also reaping the benefits of not necessarily having that in-tune emotion through the process of reciprocity. And so I think one of the best things to do in order to manage emotions is to engage with someone who is on the opposite side of the scale with you.
Yeah. Yeah. Because I feel the same way, like in terms of the power of your approach to emotional processing being so different than mine, and like our natural tendencies. I feel like you help to ground me on things when my emotions are taking over my actions. And I've found that that's been really helpful as a tool, that like I feel I can definitely come up with a number of examples where I feel like my emotional range has been helpful to you, but I can come up with as many examples where your stoicism, I guess is how I'll put it. That has been helpful to kind of like ground me in what's real, as opposed to like, and what's important, like specifically being able to tie things back to value, because I have a sense of urgency that kicks up. And you've been really helpful as a partner to kind of keep me grounded on what I said I wanted to do, as opposed to like what my inbox tells me I should be doing based on what people want from me. And so, yeah, I feel like, if I had to put a finger on it, I feel like that's like one of the superpowers of our combination. So yeah, I'm glad that you brought that up.
100%. Yeah. And like, so we're about, I think, nearly halfway through the list. And I think one of the things that this sort of opens the stage for is like, it's clear that there's actually value in being different. But again, for that value to be realized, we have to be able to view the world and communicate what we're seeing. And in a certain way, you can word that as being able to observe and criticize the world, or provide a critique of the world. And so I think that sort of leads us into our next principle, which I think would be great if you could talk a little bit about, because I think and maybe it is that element that provides us emotional sensitivity, also makes you able to sort of pick out and critique and differentiate things. And so I'd love it if you could talk a little bit about like how the principle, like how dialogue actually leverages our ability to kind of get into this constructive feedback using our own different perspectives.
Yeah. Yeah, that's I feel like this principle is one of the hardest because it can feel like it's personally victimizing you. I feel like this is the one where you admit that your peers can be mirrors if you let them. But if you don't let them, like they'll stay at an arm's length and they won't quite make it into that peership place. And I think that the trick to getting in there is having that critique and having the reflective dialogue. Like, to be honest, that like conversation two stuff, right? The collaborative problem solving stuff where you're asking the hard questions, especially the hard questions about leading them down the path of considering whether or not pivoting is a good idea. Like, I think that being the person who can say to somebody who has been just like, beating their head on the desk, trying to do something, like to be that person that lets them explore, even for a few minutes, what it looks like to go a different way and to really push them. I feel like that's one of the kindest forms of critique that we can provide as peers. It's just to like critique our use of energy. Like I have a good friend that I spend a lot of accountability time with, and they recently asked for a calendar audit, and it was a joke. And then I totally was like, no, you should really do that because I need it. And we did it the other day, and it was so, it was really satisfying. But it was also, like I said, it called me out hard. I'm telling this person that I want to be accountable to them in these ways and that I want to change these things about me. And they are seeing clear evidence of me sliding back on so many of those promises to myself. So, but then we were also able to have like a super constructive conversation about like, what do I need to do? Because the thing that I tried isn't working. Like the milestone I set, that approach, not working. Like it was definitely, it's time to pivot because what you're trying, it's been going on for a couple months. It's not working. So let's do something else. And yeah, this week is the first week of that something else. And I feel not only empowered, but I also feel really accountable to her. And that means a lot. So yeah, I think that one's, that like ability to call people in instead of calling them out, I think is just like, it all has to do with being able to understand the person enough to do that. I think that doing that really early in a peership is probably less safe to do, but as you gain more and more comfort with folks, I think that is an important role that we play.
100%. And, as you were talking about that, like a specific moment sort of just like jumped into my mind. And it was like, and I didn't realize it until you said that, but one of the people who gave me quote unquote permission to drop out was that friend I was talking about, Nicola. She was the first person I ever even floated the idea to outside the safety of my own brain. And I think it kind of comes back to this thing of the idea of giving somebody permission to quit when their milestone is not serving their goals, as you said, is absolutely right. And one of the things that's missing in the formation of children in schools is like, when is your choice actually not a great idea and the right answer is to quit and find something new? It's like, it's always finish playing with the team until the end of the season, finish the subject until you graduate, finish this, and it's like finish things for the sake of finishing. And you end up just torturing yourself on something that you'd be better served just throwing away.
Yeah. No, it feels like accountability is the ultimate form of being seen. Like it's like people actually wanting to complete that loop with you of not just like, oh, I'm thinking about doing this, but actually like, this is what I'm going to do towards that. And like, this is how it went. Not so good. Circling back. Like maybe this isn't for me. Like it's that first part, that's the easy part. And we all have that person or people in our life that we can go back to and think about like, those sliding door moments of like the first person that I said, I think I want to write a book. Like, and those moments are super impactful too. Once it comes out of us, it's sort of like, I feel like that kind of momentum can really be of value. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, let's move on to our last principle. So the last one that we came up with was to promote inclusivity and diversity of thought. And based on the list that we went over in episode 1, in terms of the way that we are different, we have a ton to say about this. But can you think of a time with us having diverse viewpoints in a conversation and how hopefully that led to a better outcome than expected?
Now, again, there's one example I think which we've already spoken about in the podcast, which I'll lightly touch on, and then I'll speak about another one. And that was when we initially came to this idea of in the 4-part reflection. It was what you're good at, what your strengths, the ways that you want to serve, and before that it was what the world needs, and then it was how you get paid. That was essentially like the framework as it was when we first started. And then we eventually reached that question, and there was something about it that didn't feel right to you. And initially, again, we weren't sure what it is, but there was this feeling. And as we actually talked about it, you started to describe that, like, you can definitely see the possibility of students coming into this who've got their professional life relatively sorted out. And that's not necessarily the mess that they're looking to make sense of. There's this whole other category of people who have their personal lives that are sort of either have changed drastically recently or something has come up, who are looking to make sense of that. And so, I was still very much, and especially because of where I am in my career, I'm still very much thinking about professional growth and growth in general are almost synonymous. But, I think you're at a stage where, there's more than that. You're thinking about, obviously you have your child as well, which kind of broadens the scope of the people that you're thinking about. And so I think that's an aspect of things where looking at things from your perspective allowed me to sort of change my mind and see things differently. And again, as I mentioned, that's an example which we'd already somewhat talked about. There is something important that I wanted to mention about this specifically, and it sort of relates to the ideas of diversity and inclusivity together. Mm-hmm. Because I think, those terms get thrown around so much and they get used so much, especially now in the corporate space. Everybody is thinking about it and trying to navigate their way around them. But I think an interesting realization that I came to when exploring this is that diversity and inclusivity are two opposing forces. In some sense, they mean different things, because in the one sense, you're saying we want to include everyone and everyone should be in the in-group. But diversity requires there to be an out group. You can't have a diverse group of people who are all in the in group. And so instead, what it's saying is that both of these camps have something useful to tell us. Inclusivity tells us that everybody has something valuable to bring to the table. And diversity tells us that there is something important about even the things we don't understand or that we don't see. And that's sort of reflected in the idea of the meeting of minds. And so being able to have people in your group, in your community, in your circle, who can be the voice of diversity. So, you sort of pay heed to diversity by having this range of people who are different too. But you also pay service to inclusivity by being able to take yourself out of your own position and put yourself in from their point of view and see that and know that though they see the world differently, it doesn't mean that either one is wrong or right. We see the world differently because we're different. Mm-hmm. And so that might be how we close the loop on that question specifically. And I think it'll be interesting to hear a little bit from you, whether you found any specific examples of this in your experience where we've kind of had to look at things from different perspectives.
Yeah, for sure. I feel like one of them that immediately came to mind is your role in helping me to slow down and qualify potential partnership and collaboration requests. I have been really struggling with how to approach those kinds of things for years. And I've been very much just a yes, no person. It either feels hot or cold. And that's pretty much how I decide. And I really have appreciated that you take such a different approach to these things. And the approach specifically that I appreciate is the slowing down of it. I remember the first time Alfi offered to go to a meeting with me because I didn't know how to slow down. And he kept telling me that I needed to, and I didn't know what that looked like. So he was very kind to model that for me in a meeting with a potential partner. And it was like life-changing. It was an hour that I am thankful for all the time, because it showed me that like we didn't need to rush to a conclusion. We didn't need to rush to a decision or an idea. We just needed to get to know each other in the context of this potential partnership. And that's really changed the way that I work, I think. And I've trusted you on other things similar to that going forward, because I feel like that's it's such a value to have a peer in things like that as a small business. So yeah, I feel like that was a way that I was really different from you. Just wanted to kind of rush through, get to the idea, execute. Like it's either hot, cold, yes or no. I'll just decide right now. And yeah, you've just really pushed me to like slow down, qualify, like compare to my values, think about both ways, you know, that things might go. So yeah, that's been really valuable. Yeah.
Amazing. Yeah. I'm
all right. So should we sum it up? Should we close down the pod? So. Episode 3. What? We did it.
Yep.
Okay. So here, let's just close with just kind of recapping the list. So we went through 5 principles of effective dialogue. The first was embrace openness and reciprocity. The second is seek to understand before being understood. The third is acknowledge and navigate emotional reactions. Fourth is utilize dialogue for reflective and constructive feedback. And the fifth and final, promote inclusivity and diversity of thought. Alfi, you want to add anything? You want to say anything to close us down? Talk to the listeners?
Yeah. So this has been a good one, and a conversation that is close to my heart. Dialogue has definitely gotten me through some tricky situations, and so I encourage everybody to have a conversation that they otherwise wouldn't have, whether that's talking to somebody new or talking to somebody who you haven't spoken to for a while. But I think the people do want to know. They want to know, Abby, how made sense of are you today?
Oh, I'm so glad that we're doing this on a regular basis, because I'll be able to like listen back to see this whole journey. This month has been crazy. I feel like I have been on a roller coaster of emotions. The highs have been high. The lows have not actually been that low, which is nice. It's like a kind of like one of those like kiddie coaster type of vibes. But it all feels like familiar anxieties lurking at every turn. And so that would be how I am right now. And like, I think yesterday or earlier this week, you and I were talking about the spiral concept, and how when you're dealing with something, when you're healing from something, when you're confronting something about yourself, that it's not really a straight line from the before and then the after. It's more like this spiral where you're going around the point again and again and again. And so, yeah, I'm getting closer, but like still a roller coaster, but downgraded to kiddie coaster. So feeling really good about that. I feel like I might have like a lazy river situation going at some point, you know, with the inner tubes and lemonade, like that whole vibe. So yeah. Mm-hmm. How about you? How made sense of are you these days?
I would say overall, I would say it's been a relative climb since we last checked in. I think there have been a couple of downward slopes and upward rises. But it does feel like I'm somewhat turning a new page. I feel like the creative juices are starting to spring up again, and I'm probably going to do a little bit of writing while it's still springing and bubbling. But outside of that, I think I also have, a couple of things that happened that just to remind me every now and then that, family's here and appreciate them, and they might not always be here. So let them know that you appreciate them while they are.
That's a lovely place to leave when we're talking about peership and dialogue. Yeah.
And I think before we do wrap it up, I think we've got something super important to share with the sense makers. Abby?
We do indeed. We are now open at the Sense Makers Club for founders membership. So starting in June, we're going to have a new topic of discussion every weekday We have 40 really amazing, thoughtful, kind, just welcoming folks that have been training under me for the last 6 weeks, and they're ready. They're excited. We've been running a dress rehearsal this last month. I got to attend a couple of the discussions, and they're just so full of energy and new ideas and cross-pollination. And it's been really exciting to see this community just at the scale of 40 people. And we're really looking forward to seeing how it's going to look with a lot more people. So if you're interested in founding membership, we are going to be running this as a special offer before we officially open June 3rd. And if you're interested in learning more, we're doing a special event, a free special event on May the 31st from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern. And we're calling it the Sense Makers Salon. So I'm very excited about that. We're going to be pairing different groups together and kind of focusing their discussions on topics in the overlap. I think it's going to be a really fun and special community, and I really hope to see you there. Yeah. And Alfi is running. Alfi, do you want to tell them a little bit about the group that you're running and your partnership there?
Yeah, definitely. So myself and Sahar are going to be taking on the topic of making sense of relationship building. And, I'm so keen to do this one because I think I always spend time talking with other extroverts about how great it is to have discussion and dialogue and all of these things. But I think it's going to be good to come into a place where we're having a round table conversation about a topic which, I've got my own specific view on, but instead of simply having my own view, we're going to have a couple of different people who feel different ways about it to be able to share and get to see things from each other's sides. And, I don't even want to spoil our first, umbrella question, but it is a super exciting one. There's been good reviews, even just from the discussion prompt.
Oh, awesome. That's great to hear. Yeah. So just to give a little bit of insight into the club. So there's 20 groups and each group has its own place on the monthly calendar. So there's kind of a consistent cadence of when each group meets. There's also chat channels that members have access to. So once you've gone to one of those meetings, you can get invited into the channel to further the conversation. There's an all access pass to all 20 groups for one low price. So we're really excited about it. And with that, I think we're going to close down episode 3. We did it. I'm proud of us. As always, do all the things that you do when you like podcasts. Share them, send them to your friends, send us emails if you listen to this thing. We see the numbers going up, but we've only heard a little bit from folks. So if you've listened to any of these, we would love to hear what you're thinking, what you want to hear more of, what you want to hear less of, all that stuff. Also, subscribe, review, all the things. And with that, I think I'll sign off by saying what I always say. Be clear.